Hello everyone, we'll just wait a minute or two for some more people to join us and then I'll say a proper hello, good morning to everyone. Well, hello everyone, good morning. My name is Pete Goddard and I'm chair of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee, the WALK. It's wonderful to have so many people with us today, to know that you're joining us from the four corners of the world, and you are all very welcome. Thank you especially to those of you from where the time difference makes this actually quite a difficult thing to do, and this applies to some of our speakers too. It's also very heartening that so many people have a passion to improve the welfare of animals in the wild at a time when there are so many pressures on the natural world that we share with them. Now, before we start the main part of the conference, I'm just going to speak for a few minutes to tell you something about the Wild Animal Welfare Committee, the WALK, raise some important matters to tell you about wild animal welfare, indicate some of the questions for today, and then tell you a little bit about how the meeting is going to run. So, firstly about the WALK, which was founded in 2014 and comprises a small number of independent members, each with their own special skills and knowledge to contribute. You can find out more about the WALK on our website, but briefly, the WALK provides an independent evidence base for evaluating and assessing and improving decisions affecting free living welfare, the welfare of free living animals in the UK. But of course, we have representatives in the audience and also from the speakers from all around the world today. And many of the issues we're going to talk about will relate to animals, wild animals, wherever they are in the world. We want to increase the awareness of the importance and the value of wild animals in general. We want to promote the welfare of individual animals and individual wild animals, and animal welfare is very individual based. We also want to highlight harm to and the suffering of wild animals caused by human activity, and where possible we want to aim to reduce these negative effects. And we do this through things like conferences and discussion. Today is part of this, research reports, position pieces, we input into consultations, and we engage with a wide range of people. So what do we want to achieve today? And what do we want to get a clearer understanding of? Well, over the past 50 years, there's been a real explosion in our knowledge of animal welfare based on a scientific approach. I believe that we are really at a well-informed stage in terms of understanding concepts, particularly about what welfare means to individual animals. And if we are motivated, we can apply this knowledge to improve their condition when we impact on them. We've moved from doing things that not only reduce the negative impacts on animals, but more recently to introduce positive elements into their lives. But this is mostly in relation to farmed animals, laboratory animals and pets. And part of what we want to achieve today is to look for opportunities and methods to extend this to wild animals, particularly those on whom the human world tends to have a negative influence. There are also well-defined moral and ethical issues, and sometimes legal issues too, and principles in how we relate to animals, particularly when we control their environment or interact with them. This area is more subject to social issues and personal values, and we're going to hear more about this later today. And there's been a growing realization that animal welfare applies equally to wild animal species. We can evaluate their welfare. We know that wild animals are sentient beings and deserve our adequate consideration. We need to incorporate this recognition into relevant management decisions. But one difficulty is how we arbitrate between the needs of different wildlife species. And of course, we need to consider where our responsibilities lie. And all of this is going to be subject of the meeting today. Well, we probably ought to have a definition of animal welfare. The Scottish Animal Welfare Commission defines animal welfare as the mental and physical state of an animal, of an individual, as it experiences and engages with its environment. Wild Animal Welfare Committee has defined wild animal welfare by saying a wild animal experiences a good welfare state when its physical and mental needs are met, or where any compromises to these can be met by an animal being able to suitably adapt its environment and achieve a stable state. So it's this ability to make a suitable response that is an important aspect of welfare. Now, of course, sentience is an important area too, and the term sentience has received much more attention recently. The Scottish Animal Welfare Commission defines sentience as the ability to have physical and emotional experiences which matter to the animal and which can be positive or negative. And animal welfare is relevant here to animals that have that sentient ability. So a sentient animal can, for example, experience pain and fear, and also comfort and enjoyment. Promoting animal welfare means increasing the positive experiences that an animal has and reducing the negative experiences. And we recognize that sentient animals may have different cognitive and emotional capabilities, which means that they have different needs and wants. So we've tried to capture this in 3 questions today about wild animal welfare. Does it matter? Can it be assessed? And how can it be optimized? Now, we've broken this down into 4 sessions for the meeting today. These were in the program, and this is how it's going to run. So we're going to look at safeguarding wild animal welfare using the 5 domains approach, the contextual nature of how we value wild animals differently, the evaluation of wild animal welfare, and the interaction between individual animal welfare, species conservation, management, and human issues. However, many of the areas overlap, and it was actually quite difficult to align all the individual speakers, specifically with this topic, with these individual 4 areas, because the topics were so broad. So you may decide at the end of the day that perhaps things could have been arranged slightly differently, but we hope to give a very good coverage of all these very important areas. So we're going to be hearing about quite a lot of interesting things. For example, why animal welfare matters, how we might know that welfare is at risk and whether welfare is the right construct. We're going to hear about the 5 domains model from the start, actually, and to see how this is going to be used to assess welfare status, for example, in wildlife management. And the 5 domains model percolates into much of what we're going to hear today. We're going to ask why wild animals are valued differently in different situations. We're going to think about the most pressing welfare issues for wildlife, and we're going to see how wildlife welfare is embedded in conservation programs, captive animal management, and ethical wildlife control. And also how, in many ways, wild animal welfare is incorporated into contemporary issues such as biodiversity loss and carbon reduction. Okay, so as to our speakers, well, you'll see we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today to try and get as wide a coverage of as many topical issues related to wild animal welfare as we can. But we've actually given the speakers a considerable challenge, because we're trying to condense a lot of contemporary information into some very short presentations and actually pushing things down to get the kernel of what's what the ideas are into a short space of time is actually quite difficult. So my thanks to all the speakers for doing a great job in doing that, so we have a great coverage today. And we are going to cover a wide area of wide range of interests related to wild animal welfare. There's going to be a lot to take in, but you can look at the presentations again on the Wild Animal Welfare Committee YouTube channel. And of course, you can look at the speakers' own websites. So I apologise that actually formal introductions are going to be quite brief today. Now, we hope to introduce a number of aspects of the latest thinking about animal welfare and present it to you by those at the cutting edge of both research and hands-on application. I'm really delighted that we've been able to entice experts from all around the world to come and speak to us and share their ideas. And as with the delegates, I do apologise to those speakers for whom the time difference has made an early or a late start to their day. So thank you very much. So yeah, so here's a potted version of what we're going to hear about. We're going to hear cutting edge research. We're going to hear about hands-on wildlife management. We're going to hear about ethical analysis, interactions between conservation and welfare, some human-animal interactions, animal welfare assessment methods, and of course, this is all going to lead to important questions for the future. So I'm now going to just briefly say about how the conference is going to run. We have pre-recorded presentations from the speakers. They'll be introduced by chairs. After each presentation, we'll take some specific questions if time allows, and you can put those in the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try and pick up those both in the specific talks and if time allows, and also in the forums at the end of the morning and afternoon. And as I say, in those forums, all the speakers from that session will come together and we'll try and pick out some common ground for them to debate. You can find the speakers' biographic details on the GoToWebinar and Walk websites. And now here's a very important technical point for you. I mentioned the seminar is cut into 4 different sections today. A section now which will end at 10:20, we'll have a break, and then a late morning session, early afternoon, late afternoon. Because of the need to upload the presentations and the capabilities of the GoToWebinar, these sessions will close after, for example, we have the last speaker in the first morning session. You will need to log in again separately to each of the 4 sessions using the details you have. So after Sarah Dolman's presentation on marine mammal welfare that ends at 10:20 this morning, the session will be closed, but it will reopen again for the 10:40 session. So you use the same details, but will need to log on 4 times. I said you can post questions on the GoToWebinar platform, and there'll be recording of the session on our Walk YouTube channel. So finally, thank you very much to all of you for joining us today, and for those of you that have made donations to the Walk. Thank you to the speakers. I haven't spoken to them all individually today, of course, but it's wonderful you've been able to contribute to us. And thank you to my Walk colleagues, some of whom will be chairing the session. I would like to thank you for particularly providing support and technical assistance, and for allowing us to use the GoToWebinar platform. So we do hope sincerely that you will have an informative and enjoyable day, and that will apply to all of us, to the speakers, to the Walk committee. We're all going to learn a lot, and we're going to have a fantastic time, I'm sure. So without more ado, I shall return to our 3 original questions. Wild animal welfare, does it matter? Can it be assessed? And how can it be optimized? And hopefully by the end of today, we might be a little bit clearer and a little bit closer to answering some of those questions. Well, that's it from me from the introduction. I'm now going to hand back the controls to Stephen Wickens, who's looking after us. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Here's the program for this morning. I'm going to introduce our first speaker from New Zealand, Ngaio Beausoleil. Ngaio's Associate Professor in Applied Animal Ethology and Animal Welfare Science and co-director of the Massey Animal Welfare Science and Bioethics Centre at the Vet School in Massey, New Zealand. She leads the development of the 5 domains model, moving on from the work of David Mellor and Cam Reed. And I'm delighted that she's contributing to our conference today because, as I've mentioned already, and many of you will know, the 5 domains model impacts directly or indirectly on so much of what we do. So it's with great pleasure I'm going to hand over to Ngaio. Thank you, Ngaio.
Welcome, everybody, from wherever you're dialing in from and whatever time it happens to be for you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And I'd like to start my presentation today with ngā mihi nui, some big thanks to a few people. Firstly, to Pete Goddard and to the Wild Animal Welfare Committee for the invitation to speak today. Really glad to have the opportunity to do so. I'd also like to thank Stephen Wickens from U4 and Libby Anderson from the committee for organizing this amazing conference. And I'd like to throw a shout out to some of my colleagues and co-authors on all sorts of activities relating to wild animal welfare, particularly to David Mellor, who is one of the authors of the 5 domains model that we'll talk about today, and who is a kaumātua or a founding father of our discipline of animal welfare science. So without further ado, I wanted to make the point that in preparing this presentation, I looked back at a presentation that I had given about 3 years ago that had a similar flavor about wild animal welfare and its assessment. And I noted that I had prefaced that presentation with this quote here. This is a quote that came from the editorial board of the Journal of Wildlife Disease in one of their journal publications in 2016. So this is from about 5 years ago. And they make the point that mentioning the phrase animal welfare in relation to wildlife does not represent an accusation or an indictment of the work being done any more than does discussing the suitability of the techniques used to gather data or the statistical methods used to analyze them. And it occurred to me that at the point that I was making that presentation about 3 years ago, I felt quite anxious about the reception from the audience. So this was a Society of Conservation Biology audience, and I apparently felt the need to kind of smooth the way for a discussion about wild animal welfare. I'm pleased to say that in preparing this presentation today, I don't have any of those anxieties. So either we've made some progress in our interactions between disciplines, or I'm simply sort of preaching to the choir and you guys are already well on board with notions of wild animal welfare and its scientific assessment. Anyway, I think it's a good thing. So what I'd like to cover in the next 25 minutes or so is as follows. The first thing I want to talk about a little bit is the background. So why should we be interested or concerned about wild animal welfare and its assessment? How should we go about assessing wild animal welfare if we choose to do so? I'd like to talk a little bit about how we understand or characterize animal welfare, because that characterization can have quite a significant impact on the way that we go about doing our assessments and the application of the outcomes of those assessments. And then I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about the 5 domains model that we use very commonly for the assessment of the welfare of all sorts of different animals. For those of you not familiar with the model, I'd like to just talk briefly about how it works. Talk about some of the specific contexts in which we've applied this for assessing wild animal welfare so far, some of its advantages, and then because the 5 domains model, like any model for assessment of animal welfare, it has limitations and we need to be aware of those. And then finish off with some take-home messages. So I just really want to touch very briefly on this idea of why we should consider it and perhaps be concerned about wild animal welfare. And I don't want to go into this in any depth because our next speaker is going to talk about this in much more detail. So really this is just sort of a brief warm-up, I suppose, to talking about the assessment of wild animal welfare. One of the key reasons given for considering wild animal welfare is to fulfill moral responsibilities or obligations that we may feel that we have to animals. And there are various different sort of ethical positions on whether or not this is the case. The point I'd like to make, though, is increasingly the reality is that many wild animals, whether free living or captive, are influenced by us, by our presence, by our activities, by what we choose to do around or with them. And those influences can be both direct and indirect. So just to give you some examples, we move animals around all the time to places that they may not otherwise be today, and in part because of our presence. So we've got at the bottom there, translocation events. We help animals when they get stuck, and that's when they get stuck perhaps because of natural causes or perhaps because of direct or indirect human activities or our presence. So we've got the example of stranded pilot whales up here and people feeling very strongly about the need to go out and help those animals and refloat them. We manage wild populations of animals. And the picture up in the top left-hand corner here is one of our wonderful, very, very rare New Zealand parrots. This is a kakapo popping his head into a feeding device. And the point here is that the purpose of this activity in the photograph is to monitor the weight and the activity of these birds. So these animals are extremely rare. Their populations are very small, and there is intensive management of these animals to try and maintain and to grow those populations. Every individual is known, every individual is tagged, and everything they do is monitored and recorded. So we monitor those populations and manage them. We also, if we look at the very bottom of the screen, manage populations not to grow them, but to reduce them. So if we think about the whole range of introduced animal species that have ended up somewhere they may not otherwise have arrived because of our actions, and we directly intervene in their lives, often in lethal ways. We visit animals in their natural environments for our entertainment. So you see the classic picture of a wild tiger there, and you see that perhaps they're not quite as wild and undisturbed as the nature documentaries would suggest. And importantly, we study these animals, and we study them for various reasons: to understand the direct impacts that we have on them, to understand the indirect impacts that our activities and our presence may have on wild populations and individuals. So things like the effects of climate change, for example. So the point is, whether we like it or not, we are in many ways affecting the welfare of many wild animals. And some people consider that that growing influence confers a growing moral obligation or responsibility to consider their welfare. So if we think about our moral responsibilities to animals, we then have follow-on questions, and those include questions like, which animals do we have responsibility for? And we usually confine our concerns about welfare to animals that have the capability of suffering. In other words, animals that are capable of having mental experiences that matter to them. They are sentient, and that's debatable. Related to that, we usually are aiming to achieve the objective of minimizing the negative impacts we have on animals, or avoiding the kinds of activities that may be considered to have unacceptable impacts on them. And so those sorts of questions become important when we think about things like the lethal control of introduced species. So we have all of these kind of ethical or moral considerations and reasons why we might consider the welfare of wild animals. Regardless of those ethical considerations, there are other valid reasons for considering the welfare of wild animals. And some of these relate to our ability to achieve or to support our conservation goals. So, for example, there are situations in which an animal with poor welfare state may also have poor or impaired fitness. And so what this means that impacts on animal welfare can also limit or stymie our attempts to support individual animals or to try and maintain or grow populations of wild animals. And a good example of this is the stress associated with translocation events. Not only does that stress impact on animal welfare during and after the event, but can also impact on fitness, survival, reproductive success. Another important point is really about doing good science. So in research studies on wild animals, if we have impacts on their welfare, this can also impact on the quality of the data collected and the applicability of that data to future decision making. So a really good example of this is if we apply identification marks that influence the animal's behavior or welfare, this can lead to data that don't accurately represent the animal's natural behavior, and that can impair our decision making for the animal's conservation in the future. And then a third reason is that in order for conservation to be successful, we know that those kinds of activities have to be socially acceptable, and they have to be supported by philanthropists and by the communities in which they're occurring. So that kind of support and acceptability takes the tangible form of permissions, of funding support, and of manpower, volunteer contributions to conservation activities. So that social license to continue doing this kind of work, or the social acceptability, becomes really important in contentious situations, and these are certainly on the rise. So people have concerns about ex situ conservation activities, the acceptability of zoos, for example. Again, lethal control is a really contentious issue, both of introduced species, but also of overabundant native animals. And visible marks on charismatic wild animals is also a sort of a hot topic as well. So we have some good reasons for being interested or concerned about wild animal welfare. And so the next step really is to think about, if we have decided that we need to assess the welfare of wild animals, how should we go about doing that? The first thing that's important to consider is whether or not we think about welfare the same way. Do we have a shared understanding of what welfare means? And this is really important. We don't necessarily all have to agree, but it's important that we have an understanding of what people consider or understand welfare to be. The reasons that's important is because your understanding of welfare can influence a whole bunch of other things downstream. So firstly, what you consider welfare to be can influence whether or not welfare gets assessed at all. The second thing is that our understanding of welfare can influence the way that we assess it, and in particular, it can influence the emphasis we put on different aspects of welfare. And I'll touch on this again in a moment, but some parties will focus on things like fitness or survival aspects of welfare, the health or physical state of the animal or its behavior. Other people might focus or think it's more important to consider the mental experiences of animals. And finally, our understanding of welfare is really important because it influences the weighting that is given to the outcomes of our welfare assessments, how important that information is considered. And that can influence our daily practice, but it can also influence our standards and the way that we put weight on animal welfare amongst the host of other things that we need to consider in most situations, and that can influence how things are written into our legislation, into our policies, our regulations and guidelines. So it's really important as a starting point. Other things that are important when we're thinking about how we should assess animal welfare, wild animal welfare on a general level, is that our assessment approaches should be systematic to ensure that we cover everything and think about everything that we should. They should be transparent so anybody looking at them can see how we've arrived at the conclusions that we have, and they should be science-based. And importantly, if and when appropriate, evaluations of wild animal welfare should consider not only negative or detrimental impacts on animals' welfare, but also benefits and positive outcomes for welfare as well. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes sharing with you one widely accepted way of conceiving of animal welfare and a model that's associated with that conception of animal welfare. So if we think about the shared understanding of animal welfare, or at least starting our process by characterizing what we consider welfare to be. Now, this again is from the presentation that I gave to conservation biologists a few years ago. And I want to start off by making the point that these are very much generalizations. So not everybody within each of these disciplines will agree with what I'm saying here. Really what I'm just talking about is some general tendencies for differences among different disciplines. So if we look at the way that welfare is characterized in the literature and the way that people talk in conservation biology or conservation science, there's an emphasis on the biological function of the animal. And we might characterize that as a fitness focus to understanding animal welfare. So according to this characterization, if an animal is healthy and it is alive, and perhaps if it's reproductively successful, then that animal would be considered to have good or adequate or acceptable welfare. Again, remember, these are generalizations. In contrast, if we have a look at how many people in animal welfare science as a discipline think about welfare now, we tend to have more of an emphasis on the importance of mental experiences or feelings to the animal's welfare. So we might consider that good or acceptable welfare arises when the animal has minimal or temporary negative experiences and also has the opportunity for some positive experiences as well. What's really important here, though, is that this is not an either-or situation. So in animal welfare science, many of us consider that there is a dynamic interaction between the animal's physical state, its biological function, and its mental experiences. And I'll sort of build on this as we go along. And so, in other words, they are not separate. Biological function leads to mental experiences influence an animal's biological function. They are inextricably linked and they must be considered together. So in animal welfare science, rather than it being fitness or feelings, really we conceptualize welfare these days as being fitness and feelings. So if I just sort of give you a bit of a summary of how we consider animal welfare to be characterized in my discipline, again, a generalization, we consider that animal welfare is a state within the animal itself. And that state at any particular point in time arises because of the sum of all of the different mental experiences that the animal has. And those are mental experiences that matter to the animal. They have significance or meaning to the animal. In other words, we're interested really in how the animal experiences its own life and its own self within that life. So negative experiences we consider to be detrimental to an animal's welfare state, while positive experiences have a beneficial effect. And importantly, if we're thinking about that relationship between biological function or physical state of the animal and mental experiences, and those two being inextricably linked, this is because mental experiences arise because the brain or the central nervous system, depending on what kind of animal you're looking at, gathers information collected by sensory receptors. And those sensory receptors tell the animal's central nervous system something about, number one, the internal state of the animal, its physiological status. Do I have enough water in my blood? Do I have enough glucose? Am I the right temperature? But also the animal's perception of its external environment. Is there a predator coming? Is that conspecific friendly? Where can I find food? How do I go about behaving in this situation? That sensory information is processed, it's integrated, and it is turned into a mental experience that basically informs the animal about what is the sensible thing to do now and next. So if we look at the negative experiences, we can really think about many of these acting as signals to the animal that there might be a problem arising or about to arise, and that the animal needs to respond in some way to either circumvent that problem arising or to address it so that it's not a threat to survival. And these are things like hunger, experiences like thirst, breathlessness, pain, nausea, and fear. So if we think about an animal's welfare state at any particular point in time, we consider that it can range on a continuum from very bad at one end to very good at the other. Now, if we have a look at a model that we use for assessing animal welfare, you'll see that this understanding of welfare and the relationship between the physical state of the animal, that sensory information, and that giving rise to mental experiences which act as signals to the animal to direct its future behavior, you'll see that those components of this understanding of animal welfare are reflected in the structure of the model. So This is the 5 domains model to which I alluded, and I just want to explain some of the key features. So we use this as a way basically of organizing the scientifically derived information we have about the animal that tells us something about what it might be like to be that animal in that particular situation or condition. And again, we have that fitness and feelings, which is written down the bottom in the right place to reflect the structure of the model. So if we start on the left-hand side here, we have the 4 physical or functional domains. This is our fitness part. And this is kind of where we collate or organize, bring together our scientific information that we're going to use to try and understand the mental experiences and therefore the welfare status of the animal. So 4 physical functional domains, and these relate to impacts and opportunities that we can gather information about using scientific principles and methods. So in domain 1, we have information about the animal's nutritional and hydration status. In domain 2, we have information about its physical environment. So this might be the substrate, the air quality, the temperature, those sorts of things. In domain 3, we have the animal's health or functional status. This is about whether or not there's any disease or injury processes occurring or any other functional impairment. And in domain 4, we have the animal's behavioral interaction with components of its environment. And this includes interactions and perceptions of other animals, including human beings. So we gather information about the animal. So we use behavioral indicators, we can use physiological indicators, we can use clinical signs, we can use neurobiological indicators, pathophysiology, and sometimes we use information about the resources that we provide or the environment itself, but usually we're trying to find information about the animal itself in those situations or conditions. And we collate that information under the appropriate part, the appropriate domain in the physical functional side. That's our fitness side. That's where we use our science and we collate our information. The next step is then to cautiously and carefully use that body of information to infer the mental experiences that the animal might be having that matter to it. And again, according to our characterization of welfare, it's these mental experiences, which we put in domain 5 on the right here, that we think are most relevant to the animal's welfare state. Really, really important to note that, as I said, the physical functional stuff in domains 1 to 4 is inextricably linked to what's going on, what we infer in domain 5. We can't measure what's happening in domain 5. These are subjective internal experiences that are not available to direct scientific assessment. And so that process is always careful and cautious inference. And our inferences are supported by what we know about the way that mental experiences can be generated by the nervous system of animals. So that's kind of, we get that transparency. We can show using the model the body of evidence we've used and how we justify our careful inference of mental experiences that are relevant to welfare. But what's really important to note is that it's not appropriate or correct, according to this characterization of welfare, to talk about the physical well-being of the animal on the left-hand side and the mental or psychological well-being of the animal on the right-hand side. They are not separable. They are not separate parts of welfare. They are inherently and inextricably linked. And we talk about what's going on in domains 1 to 4, those physical or functional factors, impacts and opportunities, giving rise to mental experiences that are important to welfare. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and I see that kind of misunderstood quite often in different places. So moving on just to look at how we've used this 5 domains model to assess the welfare of wild animals. And just in very general terms, we have some policies and some assessment accreditation schemes, for example, that relate directly to the structure of the 5 domains model for captive wild animals. So the zoo community has really taken on the 5 domains model as the basis of their understanding and assessment of animal welfare for animals in zoos and aquariums. So the bottom right here is the Caring for Wildlife strategy of WAZA, the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And again, this is based on the 5 domains very explicitly. And then up above that, we have the Zoo and Aquarium Association of Australasia. And to date, their entire accreditation process for their member organizations has been based on welfare assessment, and it's been based on the 5 domains model. So you can see that here in this diagram. We've got nutrition, environment, health, and behavior, those physical functional domains where we put our science-based information, and then we've got our inference over to the mental domain. Some work in progress in my group is we have a PhD student who's going to use the 5 domains to look at the effects, or to organize information about the effects of management on the welfare of captive kiwi. If we think about free living wild animals, as you can appreciate, this is incredibly challenging, regardless of what approach or model or framework you choose to use. And one of the really major difficulties with assessing the welfare of free living wild animals is our ability to capture appropriate data to inform welfare assessments. So at the top there, we have a theoretical desk-based assessment, and this was done a couple of years ago by a group of welfare and cetacean experts looking at theoretical scenarios and assessing the welfare of whales influenced by human activities. So this was really useful because it highlighted some of the challenges with associated the 5 domains, with applying the 5 domains to that kind of assessment. Absolutely mind-blowingly, a landmark study which I had the privilege of being a part of was undertaken by Andrea Harvey. So she really put on her big girl pants and decided she was going to do this. She was going to go out there and she was going to try and assess the welfare of free-living wild horses, brumbies, in a national park in Australia, using the 5 domains model. And she did that, and it was it's excellent. We've published a paper with 10 steps to sort of talk you through how you might use the 5 domains model to guide the development of your process for assessing the welfare of wild animals, and then how to apply and present and interpret the results. So an incredibly difficult and really thoughtful piece of work that Andrea has done, and there's more to come from her. So I suggest that you have a look at that because it's quite amazing. And again, work in progress. I have a student who is applying the 5 domains as a sort of a framework for trying to understand the impacts of stranding on whales, but also the impacts of human interventions at strandings on whale welfare. So again, very challenging work to undertake. I just want to give a quick nod to some other work that's been undertaken. So far, the most common use of the 5 domains to assess wild animal welfare has been in the realm of ways that we control introduced animals, in other words, pest animals. And there's a specific sort of application or variant of the 5 domains model that you may have encountered called the Sharp and Saunders model, developed by Glenn Saunders and Trudy Sharp. And they call this model the Sharp and Saunders model for humaneness assessment. So this is based on the fundaments. It has the same structure as the 5 domains model. And Sandra Baker, who is one of the world's experts both in this model and in the welfare of pest animals, is going to talk about this in much more detail later. So I won't say too much more about that. So I want to briefly talk about some of the advantages of the 5 domains model. The first thing that makes the model really useful is that it provides a system, and this is really the key value of the model. It provides a system. David Miller calls this an aid memoir, a way of making sure that you're looking for evidence of what might be there, and you're doing that in a systematic and comprehensive way. And this is really important because if you don't look for evidence of something happening, then you won't find it. And so the structure, the way that this is set up, really encourages users to look for and to organize the evidence of a much wider range of physical impacts or opportunities and associated negative and positive mental experiences than has been done in the past, or that is focused on in some other alternate models. And just to give you a highlight of this, we have this real sort of propensity to look for evidence of pain. However, we know that there are lots of other negative experiences that animals can have that are not related to pain, they're not related to tissue damage necessarily, but they can have really significant effects on animal welfare. And we sort of fall into this trap of looking for pain. If we don't find pain, we conclude that there is no problem. However, we have failed to look for evidence of all of those other kinds of negative experiences that might be impacting on welfare. Also really important to be specific in looking for evidence of specific negative experiences, so things like nausea, things like breathlessness, for example, because if we find evidence of those specific negative experiences, we need to specifically target them to improve welfare or to avoid them happening in the future. So if we don't look for specifics, we won't find them, and if we don't look for specifics, we don't know what to target to make improvements in animal welfare. So the model is really good for encouraging us to do that. The second thing that makes the model useful is that it encourages us to interpret what we see, what we observe, the physical impacts in terms of what they mean to the animal. And this is really important because it makes us think carefully about what the significance of the animal's situation is, or what the importance of our findings are for our decision making. It also forces us to be transparent and to be able to rigorously justify the conclusions we draw, because we lay everything out and we show the relationships between what we can observe and measure in the physical functional domains and what we infer in the mental domain or the affective domain. And that's really great because it protects us from criticisms of anthropomorphism. We can show how we've used the science, we can show where that inference is, and we're not making any claims about things that we can't support rigorously. The third advantage is that the model is versatile, so you can apply it to any species or any situation. If we contrast this to another model, for example, the 5 domains, it was very specifically designed for production animals in intensive management situations. The 5 domains is just what it is. It's just a system for checking to see what's going on. It can be modified to suit your purposes as long as you can justify those modifications. It can be used to evaluate things before you do them, so those desk-based or theoretical evaluations. It can be used to help you figure out, as I said, where your solutions might be targeted, what the problem actually is and how to fix it. And you can then go back and look at the effects of interventions that you might have applied to try and address some of those welfare issues. The model allows grading, and that those gradings can allow us to come up with relative rankings of different options. This allows us to understand what the relative impacts are if we have more than one choice, and to select the most humane option if we have the ability to do that. So this is just a very quick example of some work that we've done looking at the welfare impacts of poisons used to kill possums in New Zealand. You can see we've got 3 different agents, cyanide, 1080, and brodifacoum down the left here. We've come up with some intensity gradings, and all of the evidence to support each of those gradings would be provided in text along with a table like this, so that we can show our working and justify our conclusions. In domain 5 here inside the red box, you can see that we've actually delineated each of the different negative experiences we think the animal might be able to have. And then using this model, we can present information about so the character or the quality of the negative experiences, which is what we've listed there in domain 5. How intense those might be, so this is the overall impact here, and how long those experiences might last before the animal loses consciousness in this particular example. So on the basis of our overall impact and how long it lasts, we can assign an overall grade. So we've got 4 for cyanide, 6 for 1080, and 8 for brodifacoum. And this just gives you an example of how we can come up with some relative rankings, and we can use that to inform our decision making about which approach we might take. So very quickly, some of the limitations of the 5 domains model. These assessments are qualitative only in nature. And so we don't make any claims about our ability to give specific numeric accuracy to the outcomes of these models. Occasionally, like you saw in the previous slide there, we do use numbers. We often recommend that we avoid using numbers in our grading systems, because numbers sort of encourage people to do things like summing and averaging, which really is not justified in most cases for welfare assessment. So these assessments are qualitative, and that's appropriate. That's what welfare assessment really should be, given the knowledge that we have. The model doesn't allow us to address comparisons or to undertake comparisons of qualitatively different experiences. So, for example, it doesn't tell us what is worse, moderate nausea or moderate pain. It doesn't tell us what the animal would choose. If it had a choice, would it choose to have severe nausea for hours or moderate pain for days? And in fact, this is a limitation or a problem with pretty much all qualitative assessments or comparative assessments of animal welfare experiences. The final thing is a bit more specific to the model itself, and that is that it is really best suited for point-in-time analyses. It's not really designed to look at quality of life over a long period of time, and it's also best suited for assessment of the welfare of individual animals. And something that we've discovered as we've used the model more is that before you start to work with the model, it's really important that you choose what you're going to assess specifically. So are you planning to assess the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, or some kind of typical case scenario for the average animal within a population? And what you choose to assess really can influence your outcomes, and it needs to be useful for whatever purpose you have for the outcomes of your assessment. So just to conclude what we've talked about over the last half hour or so, the first point is that, like it or not, we influence and we will continue to influence many wild animals in many different situations. And some people consider that this influence really confers on us a moral obligation to do something about welfare. And usually what we're aiming to do is to minimize the suffering of animals that can suffer. Having said that, there are also other reasons why we might want to consider the welfare of wild animals, in particular to support our achievement of conservation goals and to maintain support for those kinds of conservation activities from society in general. If we're going to assess welfare, then we need to use an approach that is systematic and comprehensive, that is science-based and is transparent. It allows us to show how we came to the conclusions that we did. And the 5 domains model is really useful. It provides some key advantages in those regards, although of course it's not perfect. But really importantly, its structure represents our current understanding of animal welfare as being the relationship between the animal's physical and functional state, i.e. fitness, and its mental state, in other words, its experiences or feelings. So it's consistent with our contemporary understanding of what animal welfare is. This is just a list of publications, if anybody cares to have a look at them, that relate to the 5 domains as it's applied for wild animal welfare assessment. And I'm really happy to take questions or to be contacted by email if anybody has would like further information or has specific questions. Thanks very much.
Hello, Ngaio. Thanks very much. That was brilliant. Now, hopefully you can hear me and we can see you. Hello. Hi. Good. Right. Thank you. That was fantastic. Gets us off to a great start and lots of very clear messages there to deal with some quite complex concepts as well, I think. Now we've got 3 or 4 minutes and we've had quite a few questions posted now. So can we try some of these? But I'm not sure. Will you still be here at 12 o'clock when we have our general discussion forum, or will you be tucked up in bed?
I will be tucked up in bed, Pete. Unfortunately, but it's been a long day already. So I'll try and address a couple of the questions that have come through in the remaining time, if that's okay to push on to those.
I think you can see those there, because actually there was a bit of a focus on feelings and fitness, and that concept and that paper particularly, I think, were quite sort of groundbreaking in trying to bring things together. But if you can see the questions, I'll leave you to look at that, because I think there was a question about balance between the two, but also whether it was really feelings that was the important aspect of that.
Yep. Yeah. So hello, Peter, Sando, nice to see that you're there. And we've had this conversation in various different ways before. So I guess it's important for me to note that I am unashamedly aligned with the effective state orientation. So people who sort of approach animal welfare as I do, yes, we do put an emphasis on feelings or mental experiences as the thing that most directly impacts animal welfare. So we need to be clear about our sort of underlying assumptions. I guess what I would just say about that is, yes, it's a personal preference, but I really like the model because it makes sure that people don't stop at physical states. It makes sure that they actually think about, what does that tell us about the animal's experience? What does that tell us about what it's like to have that physical state, or to be exposed to those conditions or those circumstances? So for me, that's a really important next step. It's not very useful to just stop at, oh, this animal has this pathology, or this animal is exposed to this predator. We actually want to know why that matters to the animal itself. So I appreciate that other people maybe don't take that approach, but that's certainly the way that I approach animal welfare. So just following on from that, we had a question about feelings and fitness. And so just having a quick look at this, are there any circumstances where fitness and feelings come apart? I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I'll try and answer it in two different ways. The first one is probably not what you mean, but fitness and feelings in terms of the physical state of the animals and the mental experiences it might have can come apart in some situations. So for example, if the animal is anesthetized, you will still get the same physical state. You might get the same behavioral or physiological responses to a stimulus, but the animal is not capable of experiencing those. So whatever is going on in domain 5 isn't actually being experienced at that time. And we can say the same thing about things like loss of consciousness when animals are stunned, or sometimes when animals are very early on in their development, if they're too young to have the capability for those mental experiences. So that's one way of answering that question. The other way, I think, maybe is what this person meant, which is, I think what they mean is, are there times where you might have poor welfare or unpleasant mental experiences, but that's good for fitness? So the comment is made that evolution optimizes fitness. Absolutely. So I think that's correct, that there are situations where you have to have a bad time, you have to have unpleasant mental experiences to optimize your fitness. So if you don't feel frightened when a predator jumps out of a bush at you, you don't run away and you don't survive. If you don't feel pain, then you don't avoid the tissue damaging stimulus the next time, so you don't survive. And the comment was made that evolution optimizes fitness. You can also think about that in terms of mental experiences, though. Some animals probably don't have mental experiences. They're not sentient, and they have survived for many millions of years just fine. But there must be some advantage to having these mental experiences to being sentient, because it's very expensive to have a nervous system that can generate those kinds of mental experiences. So there's a big cost associated with it. So there must be some kind of adaptive advantage. And the argument for experiences like pain, for example, are that they feelings of pain that matter to the animal, that are unpleasant, that have a significance, actually change the animal's behavior in the future to help it survive better. So for example, you might be able to avoid a situation without coming into close contact with it, and that way avoid tissue damage. Oh, I have a friend. So Pete, I might stop there. I don't know how we are for time at this point.
That's
but
I think it looks like bedtime call, so that's fine.
It is bedtime. It's past bedtime, yes.
So we've got lots of questions we could ask you, and this is absolutely fascinating stuff, and it gets to the heart of the matter. But I'm afraid we should move on, but I'm really grateful that you're able to have joined us, put a fantastic presentation together for us. And yeah, as you said, I'm sure people will come back with some individual questions and to take things forward. But to you and your colleagues, thank you very much indeed. It's been fantastic for us to have you with us today. Thanks, Ngaio.
Thanks so much for having me. And email any questions that you have.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye.
Right, good night. Good. Right. No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. But we need to move on. And I know it's a bit rude to some of the speakers to move quickly on, but we're trying to pack in a lot today. And our next speaker is going to be Mark Jones, and going to pick up some of these issues that Ngaio raised about why animal welfare, why wild animal welfare matters. And Mark's head of policy at the Born Free Foundation. She has a wealth of experience of the range of research and rehabilitation in wildlife species, and this includes aspects of trade management and welfare more generally. So, Mark, I'm going to hand over to you to look, and I look forward to your reflections and thoughts on the topic of why wild animal welfare matters. Thanks, Mark.
Hi there, my name's Mark Jones. I'm a vet by training with a master's degree in wild animal health and experience working in wildlife rescue and rehabilitation in different parts of the world. And for the past 7 years, I've been working as head of policy at the Born Free Foundation here in the UK. It's a real honour to be asked to speak at this prestigious event. I've been asked to provide some thoughts on why wild animal welfare matters. And to that end, I'll be asking what we mean by wild animal welfare, the impacts of human interventions on wild animals and their welfare, how we evaluate those impacts, the current regulatory framework, and what we might do to build back better for wild animals in a post-COVID world. Before I start, just a quick word about the organisation I work for. Born Free was formed in 1984 by the actors Virginia McKenna and Bill Travis and their son Will. The charity was named after the classic 1966 film the actors starred in, which told the true story of conservationists Joy and George Adamson, who rescued a lioness cub called Elsa and successfully returned her to the wild in Kenya. The charity was originally called Zoo Check and was focused on highlighting the plight of wild animals in zoos and other captive facilities and the associated welfare concerns. While these days Born Free has expanded its activities to include field conservation projects, education and policy work, the charity has always retained its core focus on the welfare and well-being of individual animals and continues to promote the incorporation of animal welfare considerations into all human activities that involve or affect wildlife. To that end, we promote compassionate conservation, which aims to fully incorporate welfare considerations into conservation programs. And we expose and seek to reduce harmful wildlife exploitation. I think it's important to start by outlining the scope of what we're talking about here. Of course, the welfare of wild animals in their natural environment is compromised and challenged all the time through predator-prey relationships, competition for and availability of resources, weather and climatic conditions, and so on. While people do sometimes intervene when wild animals get injured by predators or are abandoned by their parents, in the main, we don't tend to advocate interfering with natural processes. What we're primarily concerned with is the human impacts on wild animal welfare, since it's those impacts that result from human activities and interventions that we're in a strong position to mitigate through human behaviour change. Now, I realise that the International Consensus Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control, published in 2017, are the subject of another talk, but I want to mention that the authors identified that efforts to control wildlife should begin wherever possible by altering the human practices that cause human-wildlife conflict in the first place, and by developing a culture of coexistence. I think this is a really important first principle that we should always begin with. Human impacts on wild animal welfare might be direct or indirect. Direct impacts include interventions for wildlife management purposes, such as for the control of pest species or diseases, the culling of badgers being an example. They include conservation interventions such as introductions, reintroductions, protection of endangered species and control of invasive species such as the control of grey squirrels to protect red squirrels. They also include exploitation of animals either taken from the wild or bred in captivity for trade and keeping, either as live animals as pets for entertainment or for experimentation, or for parts and products derived from wild animals for food, medicines, fashion products and a host of other purposes. And of course there's the exploitation of wild animals for sport, such as hunting, shooting and fishing. Indirect welfare impacts might include habitat destruction or adaptation, for instance, logging, conversion of land for agriculture and so on, development and infrastructure projects, disturbance causing, for example, abandonment or separation of dependent young or other forms of social disruption, and of course climate change, which is putting a lot of species under significant stress. However, welfare impacts are often not considered at all when evaluating the impacts of human activities on wild animals, and if they are considered, they're usually secondary to other considerations like human interests, sustainability, or endangered species protection. To give you an example, of the suggested interventions found in the literature by Baker and others to mitigate the negative impacts of wildlife trade, only 2% were directed at changes designed to benefit animal welfare directly. And I think this reflects the lack of research focus on welfare, which may in turn reflect a lack of perceived priority for welfare among policymakers and the enforcement community. But welfare considerations have massive implications for individual animals, so I would argue we have an ethical and moral duty to prioritise them. Paying due consideration to animal welfare can also benefit conservation efforts. For example, the success of reintroduction or rehabilitation and release programs depends on establishing and maintaining an appropriate welfare status for the animals involved, as well as consideration of the implications for other animals that might be affected. And there are also benefits for wider human and animal health. Stressed animals are more likely to be dangerous, and health and welfare are intimately interconnected, so animal welfare is an important consideration in disease risk mitigation, as has been highlighted by the COVID pandemic. Evaluating welfare impacts is critical if we are to make progress in reducing the suffering of animals. However, it's also extremely challenging because of the huge variety of species and issues involved, and our very variable understanding of and attitudes towards the capacity of different species to suffer and their relative tolerances to different kinds of stress and insult. In many cases, particularly with respect to illegal activities, it's also extremely difficult to carry out objective evaluations because of the clandestine nature of the activities. Welfare evaluation methodologies are often based around the Meller and Reed 5 domains model, which emerged from the Farm Animal Welfare Council's 5 freedoms model developed in the late 1970s, as we've heard in the previous talk. And these are being adapted for particular uses, for example, to enable the comparative welfare assessments of different pest control methodologies. This adaptation was pioneered by researchers Trudy Sharp and Glenn Saunders in Australia, and has been modified for use in the UK by Dr. Sandra Baker at Oxford University. So what does the current regulatory framework look like? At an international level, some conventions have provisions which, on the face of it at least, appear to have some welfare focus. The major international agreement regulating wildlife trade is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES. It currently has 183 signatory countries or parties who agree to implement decisions made at CITES into their regional or national legislation. While CITES isn't by any means primarily a welfare-focused convention, a number of its provisions do relate to the welfare of animals in trade. Before relevant permits are issued for trade in live animals listed on the CITES appendices, exporting countries are required to ensure the animals are prepared and shipped to minimise injury, damage to health or cruel treatment, and importing countries, for species subject to the highest protection, are required to ensure the destinations for live animals are suitably equipped to house and care for them. The Convention also contains language and some guidance relating to transport, the handling and management of confiscated live animals, and a requirement for commercial captive breeding operations for Appendix 1 species to be registered. However, these provisions only relate to CITES listed species and only apply when those species are traded internationally. So, for example, the prepared and shipped provisions apply from the point of export and do not account for activities relating to capture, holding or transport within the country of origin. Responsibility and interpretation and the lack of clear definitions, guidance in many cases, or accountability also limit the degree to which these provisions are effectively implemented by parties. There's also some really interesting work going on under the auspices of the United Nations Environment Programme Convention for the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, or CMS, relating to the need to incorporate considerations of animal culture and social complexity into conservation interventions, which has clear animal welfare implications and benefits. To date, this has focused on known socially complex species that fall within the Convention's remit, such as cetaceans and great apes, although there's great interest in expanding this focus to include other social migratory species, such as elephants. And there could be profound benefits for the conservation of many other migratory species as we learn more about their social complexity. Although primarily farm and companion animal focused, the World Organization for Animal Health, or OIE's, animal welfare section of its Terrestrial Animal Health Code does contain provisions relevant to some wild animal management practices, such as the transport and killing for disease control purposes. And the OIE has established wild animal working groups in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, albeit primarily concerned with disease risk mitigation rather than welfare per se. Some other international provisions include the rights of nature in Ecuador's constitution and the recognition of the need to account for animal sentience in the EU Treaty of Lisbon, the replacement for which post-Brexit is currently the subject of much campaigning and lobbying in the UK. These provisions provide an overarching ethical framework for the development of more focused national regulation. Some countries have specific animal welfare legislation, although the degree to which this applies to different species or categories of animals and different situations varies. In the UK, the Animal Welfare Act provides generic protections, and some more specific non-binding codes of practice exist, for example, for the keeping of pet primates. However, the Act only applies to animals under the control of man and not living in a wild state, so its application to wild animals is somewhat limited. The UK's Wild Mammals Protection Act makes it an offence for any person to abuse wild animals with the intent to inflict unnecessary suffering, with some exemptions. And the Wildlife and Countryside Act and other species-specific legislation may also provide some protections to wild animals. Other regulations which may have a welfare impact include zoo and pet trade licensing regulations and codes of practice, which again vary enormously between regions and countries, and in the extent to which animal welfare is adequately considered. But welfare protections for wild animals are often confusing and contradictory, and the degree of protection an animal enjoys under the law with regard to its welfare all too often depends on the circumstances in which it finds itself. To repeat the often used example from here in the UK, a rat kept as a pet in a cage is protected by the Animal Welfare Act and by various other pieces of legislation relating to the keeping of and trade in pet animals. And this protection includes the requirement, for example, for humane euthanasia should it be required. A rat in a laboratory is protected by the Animals Scientific Procedures Act, which sets out all kinds of safeguards and procedures that must be followed in order to protect the animal's welfare, including when it is killed. A rat in the gutter, however, enjoys virtually no protection at all under the law, and methods of killing wild rats which are quite legal would never be permitted for its pet or laboratory conspecifics. But it's still a rat, and as such is capable of the same degree of pain and suffering, whichever situation it finds itself in. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has focused international attention on wildlife markets and wildlife trade, including how compromised animal welfare might have played a significant role in the transfer of coronaviruses between animal species and ultimately to people. This has provided an opportunity to raise the profile of animal welfare in international forums and has resulted in calls from many quarters for example, bans on wildlife markets, the curbing of wild animal farming and commercial wildlife trade, and a rethinking of our relationship with animals and the natural world. So how can we change the paradigm and give wild animals a better deal going forward? There's been a lot of focus since COVID-19 emerged on incorporating One Health principles into wildlife management and trade practices. The One Welfare framework, articulated by Dr. Rebecca Garcia in her book One Welfare, a framework to improve animal welfare and human well-being, is arguably broader than One Health and focuses on recognizing and acting on the connections between biodiversity, the environment, animal welfare and human well-being. Other mechanisms I've mentioned, such as the International Consensus Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control, provide potential ways in which One Welfare principles can be applied in practice. At Born Free, we've been advocating for the adoption of One Welfare principles across key international policy forums, including the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework being developed by the UN Convention on Biodiversity and which will form the basis for international biodiversity policy for the coming decades, and also through the OIE's work on disease risk mitigation. We argue that such a move could form an important component of the transformative changes to our relationship with nature as called for in the 2019 IPBES Global Biodiversity Assessment. Nevertheless, it seems to be something of an uphill battle to get anything with the word welfare in it on the table at such international forums and into national legislation. The recognition by scientists and policymakers of animal sentience and the need for it to be fully considered through policy making is, I believe, an essential prerequisite for much greater awareness of the importance of animal welfare in wildlife management and protection. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found that interesting and thought-provoking.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was brilliant. Now, I don't know if you're able to join me on screen. We're sort of slightly short for time, but there has been an interesting question. Oh, hi, Mark. There has been an interesting question that perhaps if you don't think it's too rude, I think I might pick up in the forum for later on, because it's a sort of quite a generic question we've had that will impact on some of the other speakers as well, and relates to how far the interventions that we might make to improve animal or welfare or enhance wild animal welfare are limited by things that actually direct human activity has caused. But I think, if you don't mind, Mark, we'll keep that question for the general forum at the end of the morning, because I think that's got quite a wide reach, and I'm sure some of the other contributors will be pleased to chip into that one as well.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So, Mark, if you don't mind, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on, and we'll look forward to speak to you again at the end of the morning, if that's okay. Thank you very much. And it was a great talk and covered lots of really essential ground. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to the last talk in this first section of our meeting, and we're going to hear from Sarah Dolman. Sarah is one of our Wild Animal Welfare Committee members, and Sarah is an expert on marine mammal conservation. Now, particular concerns of late have highlighted the growing recognition that bycatch, the incidental but increasingly common capture of marine animals during fishing operations, is a concern. There's harm to these animals that are caught, and obviously a great welfare disbenefit to them. So Sarah is going to explore with us the welfare risks to marine mammals. And Sarah, we look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. At the Wild Animal Welfare Committee's second conference in 2019, Joe Perry presented on the range of pressures that present welfare issues for marine mammals. Here, I plan to focus in on one topic, entanglement in fishing gear, to demonstrate the welfare issues faced by marine mammals and why this matters. Bycatch impacts a range of species in different gear types in a variety of ways. Hundreds of thousands of cetaceans, hundreds of thousands of seals, and of seabirds are bycaught and killed every year. And about 1,000 porpoises, hundreds of dolphins, hundreds of seals, and about 35 whales are bycaught in UK gear in UK waters each year. Consideration of welfare impacts is important for individuals, of course, and it can also provide a valuable contribution to effective conservation of populations. It's important to demonstrate these links if we are to introduce welfare into decision-making processes that are currently almost entirely focused on conservation. Before I go on to talk about welfare, I want to briefly mention sustainability. Sustainability typically refers only to the fish or shellfish of interest. There are few examples of where eco-labels include bycaught species in their sustainability assessments. Even where laws require bycatch sustainability, this is rarely monitored or enforced, and legal requirements to minimise or eliminate bycatch are not enforced either. As a result, many populations globally are declining because of bycatch. So investigation of external and internal injuries that dolphins and porpoises have suffered resulting from bycatch was the focus of work led by Carl Salisbury for Whale and Dolphin Conservation a decade ago, and these are demonstrated in the two diagrams. On the right here is a Sowerby's beaked whale who live-stranded in Edinburgh, near where I live, a couple of years ago, with gear so deeply embedded in her blubber and with a dorsal fin entirely amputated, she had clearly been suffering for weeks or months, in the worst case of bycatch I've ever seen. But there's more to poor welfare than injuries suffered. In addition to physical compromise, pain, reduced capacity through ongoing morbidity and disease, being debilitated or emaciated, high levels of stress can lead to prolonged suffering. This was studied in the eastern tropical Pacific dolphins that are encircled in purse seine nets. Dolphins suffered organ and cardiac injury that can lead to permanent heart disease, making individuals vulnerable to further damage later with more stress, perhaps when they are set upon again by the next fishing gear, which they undoubtedly will be. In addition to injury, physical pain and stress, the removal of key individuals may cause breakdowns in social structure with important welfare implications. Paul Wade, a US government statistician, and colleagues considered why odontocetes might be less resilient to overexploitation than baleen whales. They reviewed a number of publications in detail and concluded that there were social and behavioural implications. Wade found that multiple factors act in concert to inhibit recovery of odontocete populations. That social disruption, loss of social knowledge, for example, lost wisdom, and fragmentation of social units such as allomaternal care can be non-linear and unpredictable. They stated that exploitation has effects beyond the dynamics of individual removals, and the lack of strong recovery in heavily exploited odontocete populations indicates that management should be more precautionary. So there's a cautionary point about the interaction between poor welfare resulting from social and behavioural changes and the potential impacts on populations. And we know little about the long-term impacts that result from such changes in social structure. Moving on to consider the handling of live by-caught marine mammals that are hauled on board a fishing vessel and then thrown back overboard alive by the crew. With recognition of the regularity with which this is occurring, several pieces of recent guidance have been produced on releasing marine mammals with the aim to reduce immediate mortality, to minimise injury that results in delayed mortality, and to reduce the stress that can lead to death. So what do we know about intervention success and post-release survival for those individuals that are thrown back into the sea alive? Data on the number of individuals that are thrown back into the sea are hard to come by. There are no data that I'm aware of injuries recorded before such a release. A recent paper by Australian scientists found that a quarter of cetaceans survive entanglement. This is clearly a lot of individuals, given the estimate of 300,000 cetacean deaths a year due to bycatch. And it could result in large numbers of individuals suffering longer-term poor welfare impacts. Marine mammal stranding data from the Netherlands, Canary Islands, and other places have been used to determine bycatch criteria of stranded by-caught individuals, developing valuable diagnostic tools. Scientists in the Canary Islands went a step further and have been able to identify individuals who were released alive from the fishing vessel and subsequently became stranded and died on shore because of the interaction. Bycatch rates vary from data collected on board fishing vessels to those from strandings, as we might expect. Little is known about post-release physiology, reproduction and survival. How many cetaceans are released alive? How many of those that are released suffer poor welfare, and how many will thrive? Poor welfare is a serious concern in itself, and the number of individuals released needs to be better understood. The potential scale of those released alive but in poor welfare might have a bearing on population conservation. As an example, in the best documented fishery, you may be aware of the history of the tuna purseine fleet and dolphin bycatch in the eastern tropical Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of spotted and spinner dolphins were bycaught every year, totaling more than 4 million dolphins. This was reduced to less than 1,000 dolphins per year in the 90s and has remained at this level. So many fewer dolphins are now killed each year. The fisheries involved are now considered dolphin safe. But with dolphins still routinely chased by fishing vessels and then being set upon and then released, individuals interact with fishing vessels between 2 and 50 times a year, and there's no evidence of population recovery. There remains much uncertainty and speculation about the cryptic impacts: mother and calf pair separation, lowered birth rates from disrupted mating systems, or perhaps increased predation. But the effects suffered by the population clearly go beyond bycatch alone. We need to use diagnostic tools as standard practice to help us to understand and account for sublethal impacts. Animal welfare measurements can be made to allow better understanding of wider impacts, and we can address bycatch more rapidly when considering welfare than when considering conservation alone. Consideration of welfare issues in marine species appears to be way behind terrestrial species. To my knowledge, the 5 domains approach for welfare assessment was first used for cetaceans by the International Whaling Commission in 2016. The implications for sociality for marine mammal welfare using the 5 domain approach was more recently explored by my WDC colleague Philippa Briggs. And most recently, Mellor and co-authors considered marine mammals in a 2020 5 domains model review. In December 2019, Whale and Dolphin Conservation and the Wild Animal Welfare Committee gathered 25 UK marine mammal and welfare experts in London to undertake a 5 domains assessment exercise focused on harbour porpoise bycatch and noise pollution. Collectively, we considered a fishing bycatch scenario with a 10-year-old mother and calf, harbour porpoise, encountering a net within a protected area. The mother becomes entangled. She struggles violently and then asphyxiates. We used the 5 domains approach to assess the situation, as you can see on the screen, and using the model developed by Christine Nicol and colleagues. We found that it was useful to have a range of expertise, although there remained large areas of uncertainty, for example, chronic versus acute suffering. We considered that a cetacean welfare assessment framework should be developed to help review welfare threats, to inform policy and mitigation, and to develop, for example, appropriate response and rescue guidelines. There's a need for governments, statutory agencies, and stakeholders to really reflect societal values and existing legal requirements that include welfare. This would enable more targeted and effective conservation actions, including the use of animal welfare assessments in expert advice and management decisions. The write-up is in progress, but early results identified, for example, that gaps in bycatch knowledge include a lack of information on times to death, where individuals asphyxiate in fishing gear. Bycatch would not be acceptable if it were happening on land, with consumers or retailers. As a result, welfare standards would benefit industry and should be a part of decision-making. Poor welfare is a concern in its own right and needs to be better reported, but the potential scale of those released alive but in poor welfare and the impacts on conspecifics might have a bearing on population conservation. Measures are required below any legal bycatch limit to continually reduce bycatch. Given all the existing unknowns, welfare can be optimised by using precaution in management decision-making, and this certainly does not happen at the moment in fisheries management. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'd like to thank the Wild Animal Welfare Committee for organising another fascinating conference, and particularly Pete, Libby and Stephen, and I'd also like to thank Philippa and Sandra who reviewed my presentation.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's a fascinating insight for us all today. Thank you. There's a couple of questions, Sarah. I thought we would perhaps explore, as we've got a couple of minutes before the break, if that's okay. One of them relates to the sort of universal, given the habitat territory of many marine mammals, covering very many sort of political jurisdictions. How common is the appreciation that welfare is a big issue for these animals that are caught in fishing operations?
I don't think there's much appreciation for bycatch at all, actually, let alone welfare impacts. I think that consumers tend not to think about bycatch. I don't think it's such a well-known issue. And certainly people take a lot of confidence from labels, from eco-labels, such as dolphin friendly, when the reality is that dolphin friendly labels are often supposed to mean they're supposed to be about sustainability, and so that welfare doesn't factor into those at all. So I think we are at the beginning of a long curve, and I think we've got an awful long way to go before we really before we effectively think about sustainability of bycatch, let alone welfare impacts, unfortunately.
Thank you. We've had a question in, you may have seen it, that it sort of relates to aquaculture, producing fish in a sort of farmed way as a potential mitigation measure for the fishing that causes injury to marine mammals. Do you think that's ever going to be a solution?
I think that is a difficult question to answer because there are so many layers to it. I think that aquaculture itself has an awful lot of problems, not just for the fish and other species who are farmed, but for the the wild fish that are caught to feed those captive fish, and then also for the wild animals, the wild protected species who live around the fish farm. So aquaculture still causes problems for wild marine mammals, both for cetaceans and for seals. In some areas they're shot. That's recently been banned in Scotland, I'm pleased to say, but because of that now, the industry is looking for other ways to keep predators out of aquaculture facilities, and the use of acoustic deterrents is one of those, and those can cause habitat displacement, including at close range and after repeated exposure, auditory impacts for species like harbour porpoises and potentially minke whales, which are coastal species, and the coastal habitats are really important for them. So aquaculture is definitely not the solution. There are some fishing practices that have lower bycatch levels. Undoubtedly, gill nets, so static nets are the worst, not just for marine mammals, but for seabirds, in many places for turtles and elasmobranchs too. So I think shifting away from gill nets would be one solution. Any fish that is caught by hook or line where you're just catching individuals is a more welfare-friendly approach, not just for protected species, but for fish species too, apart from the individuals being caught, of course.
Thank you. Just in the last few seconds, final question, I guess, and it's whether you think certification schemes adequately encompass some of these negative impacts on marine mammals, or do you think there's some way to go in terms of true cost accounting?
The short answer is no. They certainly don't account for welfare at the moment. I think that there's a role for certification schemes. Certainly the biggest one, the Marine Stewardship Council, recognises bycatch and it includes it in its modelling. It includes it at the level of sustainability, but we're not there yet. And if you buy MSC or any other certified fish or shellfish, you certainly can't be confident that there hasn't been bycatch, or even that the bycatch is monitored in some fisheries. Not yet.
Right, well, on that note, thank you very much, Sarah. It's a fascinating talk, and it sort of opens up a whole new domain of where, probably that's a bad word to use, but a whole new area of where we need to take animal welfare of wild animals much more seriously. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
That brings to the end of this first session. You can continue joining the conference, but you'll need to join again, as I mentioned at the start. We're going to end this session in a moment. Stephen's put up the programme for the session that will begin at 10:40 UK time, but to watch that and to join in, which we hope you will, you'll need to log on again using the same joining instructions. So on that note, I will thank all our morning speakers. We're going to see some of them again in the forum just before the lunch break, but for now I'll say cheerio, and I'll leave you for the next session in the hands of one of my colleagues, Liz Molyneux. So thank you all very much for now.